You started the screen? Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening, both here in church and streaming online. Before we start introductions of our presenter tonight, let us just take a moment to begin quieting our minds and opening our hearts with prayer. So I'll lead us in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord Almighty, great Creator, we praise you. May we lay down any of our failures from this day. Forgive us, Lord. Thank you for this opportunity, for this teaching and time with Dr. Jacobs. Thank you for the Respect Life ministry, and may we honor you, Lord, in all that we say and do. May you, Lord, always be at the center. Lord, we pray for this evening, that the opening of our hearts and our minds this evening. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dr. Steve Jacobs, our presenter this evening, will share information and perspectives to help you and I be advocates for life. I've already participated in this training via Zoom and can attest the information is thorough, deep, and very informative. Dr. Jacobs, our presenter, has been the program director of Illinois Right to Life since August of 2019. Prior to his current role, Steve graduated with his law degree from Northwestern University School of Law and a PhD from University of Chicago. His writings have been featured by Daily Wire, Newsweek, and The Hill, and his research on when life begins has been featured in Breitbart, Quillette, and One American News Network. He has presented to college and law students at University of Chicago, Northwestern University School of Law, Loyola University, and the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. Please provide a warm welcome to Dr. Steve Jacobs.
Thank you, Tammy. What a wonderful prayer to start us off, really center us before tonight's discussion. I really appreciate everybody being here tonight, taking time out of their evenings to discuss these important issues. Thanks to everybody at home watching along. So, again, I want to thank you all for being here, and I don't mean that as some pleasantry. I truly want to thank you for this opportunity to interact with all of you tonight, to share what I have learned in the past 10 years that I've studied the U.S. abortion debate. In the next 90 minutes, I will work to equip you with all of the lessons that I've learned and hope to give you the ability and the confidence to passionately and compassionately advocate for life in your personal lives. Now, I was already introduced, but I just wanted to mention I'm actually a lifelong Illinoisan. I grew up in the North Shore suburbs of Chicago. I started off actually at Oakton Community College, went on to Northeastern Illinois, and then God had it that I had some good opportunities afterwards in grad school. So I studied comparative human development, and this was the focus of my research. So I also actually became a certified mediator in hopes of figuring out how to resolve this debate. So it's so easy for us to throw up our hands and assume that abortion will always be with us and that there's nothing we can do about it. But as we know, for millennia, slavery was a dominant aspect of humanity, and we were able to mostly eradicate that. So I think there's no reason why we shouldn't have hope when it comes to the rights of the unborn. Now, everything I feel I've learned over these years can be actually distilled down to these 5 points. Next slide. So these are somewhat simple distillations, but they're, let's just say the other side doesn't necessarily accept all of them, even though they are true. So first off, a human's life begins at fertilization. I know this sounds like I'm saying water is wet. Those who support life, they know this, but I had actually studied this, so I surveyed thousands of biologists around the world and found that 96% affirm the view that a human's life begins at fertilization. And that's despite the fact that 85% actually supported abortion. So I don't know if you know this, but there's actually a lot of pro-choice liberal people in academia, and I found that out in the course of my study. And the second point is all humans deserve legal protection. Again, this seems like a simple concept, but many try to talk about things like personhood to try to deny the unborn rights. Now, we know that all are deserving of protection because that's clear from 19th century senators who had passed and ratified the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and Supreme Court justices, those who actually found in favor of Roe. So Roe v. Wade I should start off there. So Roe v. Wade was the landmark Supreme Court case in 1973 that made abortion legal up until fetal viability, which is the 24th week of pregnancy. So it made it that no state can restrict abortion access before the 24th week. But Supreme Court justices who ruled in favor of that holding, they had actually said that if it could be established that a fetus is a human, then their rights would actually be guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. And I'll get into that a little bit later. So since we know that abortion kills a human, it's called a homicide. A homicide is the killing of a human by another human. And we know homicide is illegal, so therefore abortion should be illegal. And this is kind of, and we'll touch base on these points more later. I'll try to kind of beat you over the head with this to really get it ingrained in your mind. So when you talk about abortion with people, that you can ensure that they walk away fully understanding why you oppose abortion. It's not a matter of you trying to control a woman's body or you wanting to increase the birth rate. It's because we recognize it as a crime. We recognize it as a form of homicide or murder. So obviously, not everyone recognizes these simple truths, but the question is why? So is it because we, as pro-lifers, are not clear enough in our messaging? Or is it because abortion supporters disagree with some or all of these points? And I actually want to open this up. So what do you all think? Which point do you feel that the other side fails to recognize? What's the most difficult thing for you to convince people of? Number one? Number two? Okay. Sounds good, those two. So next slide. Thank you. So consider this. In a recent 2019 poll on various questions related to the abortion debate, they found that only 38% of adults believe that a human's life begins at conception. That means pro-life people, pro-choice people, and only 19% of those who oppose strict abortion laws believe this view. Only 9% of young Democrats. So, the youth on both sides don't know this, and part of the reason is because we're not teaching it in schools. If you talk to most teachers, they won't necessarily agree with it because, as we see, most of the American public doesn't agree with it. Now, in my opinion, and as suggested by one of the audience members, this really is the crux of the debate. And this, I would say, is probably the biggest insight I have to share. Many will say that everyone knows that abortion is murder and that the other side simply believes that it should be legal, but that isn't the case. In a 1970 medical journal, the editors rightfully pointed out that Americans do not support legal killing. So the only way that abortion advocates could change our laws was by confusing the American public on the humanity of the unborn. And that's part of the reason why you will hear, certain political leaders say things like, it's a cosmic question of when life begins, or that they'll actually try to use the Bible to suggest that life begins at first breath. But we know through scientific evidence and through the scientific consensus that a human's life begins at fertilization. That simple, single-celled organism. And trust me, it's really hard to conceptualize. It's easy to see, a baby, a cute walking, talking child as a human. It's much more difficult when you think of it as a single cell. But believe it or not, that single cell has the information that will dictate how many hairs you have on your head when you're 60. The pattern of body hair that grows on your body throughout your life, how fast you'll be, how strong you'll be, how tall you'll be, it's all encoded within those genetics. And that's because that single cell was you. It was just a less developed version of you. In the same way that that infant version of yourself, when you were a baby, one wouldn't have been able to know what your favorite foods were at that point. They wouldn't know what your career was going to be one day. But at that point, that was you. And you've actually grown into a much more sophisticated human, just like that baby is a much more sophisticated version of that single cell. Next slide. So DR.ALAN GUTTMACHER, he was the namesake of Planned Parenthood's research institute. It's called the Guttmacher Institute. In 1933, he said that this fact is so simple and evident that a preborn human's life begins at fertilization, that it is difficult to picture a time when it was not part of the common knowledge. Here we are nearly 90 years later, and about 2/3 of Americans do not have this information. So clearly, abortion advocates, they have succeeded in spreading this big lie that abortion does not kill humans and that it is not a form of homicide that should be criminalized. Now, as a side note, you've probably noticed I've used homicide or murder. Most people use homicide and murder interchangeably, which that's reasonable. Now, technically, from a legal standpoint, homicide is simply the killing of a human by another human, like I said earlier, and it can be legal. So, for instance, in the case of self-defense, even though one is a human and a person, if they pose a certain imminent threat of harm, they could be killed legally under the self-defense doctrine. And this is actually seen as part of the right to life. So it's one's right to life against another's right to life. Now, murder is always illegal. So that's why, since abortion is legal today in the United States, it's technically not murder. So I prefer using homicide because it prevents people from getting distracted by this distinction. So some people, they'll get caught up and say, well, it's not murder because it's legal, and that's just really a distraction. And that's part of what I really want to impart on you all tonight, is how important it is to avoid those distractions, because that really is what the game that the other side is playing. So the other thing is, homicide actually embeds within the term the concept of human. So hom, the prefix, it is related to Homo sapiens, the species to which we belong. So, by the way, while we'll have questions, time for questions at the end, and certainly you can always email me with questions, and I'll provide my email at the end, I want you to feel free to chime in at any time if you have a question. You know, I'm not here to put on a performance or give a speech. If I had it my way, we'd be at a big round table just having a discussion. But I'm here to serve each and every one of you. This is my calling. This is the way I serve my fellow man. And my goal is to help you all become the best advocates you can be. And one crucial way of doing that is answering questions to deepen your understanding of these issues. So before I continue, do we have any questions thus far? Okay, next slide. So now that I've kind of laid the groundwork for our meeting, here's the plan. So first, I'm going to walk you through the history of abortion laws so you can better understand how we got here today and why abortion is such a divisive topic. We'll then walk through both sides of the abortion debate, pro-life and pro-choice, so-called pro-choice arguments, and discuss how to best advocate for life. And this is probably a good moment to discuss this. So when you hear pro-life, if I could get a volunteer, what do you think pro-life means when you hear that term? Okay, right. So we're essentially, the term in the beginning was pro-right to life. So the early pro-lifers, they saw themselves as human rights advocates or civil rights advocates. So we're fighting for the rights of the unborn. I know that might seem simple, but there are a lot of people today who say that pro-lifers, they need to fight immigration issues or issues related to prison reform and all of these bigger issues within what's called the consistent life ethic. And while that's certainly good work, being a pro-lifer is somebody who focuses specifically on the right to life. And then in terms of pro-choice, that's supposedly the choice to have an abortion. But when you hear pro-choice, they're not really honoring the choices that the unborn human could have one day. So that's not really the greatest term. And it's unfortunate, but the language of the abortion debate, that's one of the things I really learned in my time studying this. There are so many traps that people set to distract you from the point. So finally, I'll actually review current and upcoming legal battles so we can all understand the importance of the pro-life movement in the United States. And I'll finish by opening it up for questions again. Okay, next slide. Okay, so to begin, I want to give you a bit of a sense of the context of the U.S. abortion debate. So there's actually this preacher, he brought up this concept one Sunday. He said that there's basically 3 buckets of people out there. There are those who already support you, and that there's practically nothing you can do to stop them from supporting you because you're like-minded, right? So 2 people that believe in God, love Jesus, go to the same church, they fundamentally support each other's aims, right? Then there is another bucket of about 15% of people who are vehemently opposed to you. There's just nothing you can do to win them over. You know, as the saying goes, they've been given over to a reprobate mind. You cannot win them over. Then there's the middle 70% that can be won over. And that really, it actually shows in research on the abortion debate, polls of Americans show that about 15% support absolute abortion access. What that means is they see no reason why abortion should ever be restricted. They think every possible abortion should be taxpayer funded, and it should be legal, and it should be celebrated. That means even for sex-selective abortions, even for a perfectly healthy pregnancy, where a woman finds out that she's having a daughter, but she wanted to have a son, they support that right. So for them, if you find yourself talking to one, you can certainly still educate them, but in terms of allocating your time and your resources and your energy, those might not be the best people to have, you know, a multi-hour conversation, several-hour conversation. Now, on the other side, I went in opposite order, but on the other side are those who oppose all abortion access. So they see that there's no exceptions for rape, incest, life of the mother. They view abortion as the greatest human rights violation out there. So in that case, you know, when you're talking to somebody like that, they're not going to worry about whether you're using the right word or citing the right case. You're already in agreement. But that's part of the reason why they are on polar opposite sides. So we see it as the greatest evil, something that has taken more lives than any other form of human activity. And then the other side sees abortion as necessary for their worldview. They believe that it's the only way that we could have a growing, booming economy, and they think that women will lose all of their rights if they don't have the right to abortion. And this is actually something that pro-abortion organizations say, that every single right is contingent upon the right to have an abortion. That a woman can't even have the right to life without the right to have an abortion. Now, 70% in the middle, they actually are sympathetic to both sides. They believe that there are some reasons why there should be legal abortion access, typically with rape, incest, and life of the mother exceptions, ectopic pregnancies. They believe that there should be fetal rights and there should be protections, but that there also needs to be some protections for a woman's rights. Now, next slide. So the question is, how did we get here? How did we get to a point where there are these 2 poles and most are in the middle trying to figure out which way to go? So to start, for centuries, abortion was legal until the moment a woman felt her child stir in her womb. This is called quickening. This was because it was the first evidence that a pregnant woman had that her child was alive. So we take for granted nowadays that we have pregnancy tests. Surprise, surprise, in the 1800s, they actually didn't have early pregnancy tests. So there were actually, believe it or not, they often didn't know they were even pregnant until that first stirring in the womb. When women didn't get their periods, when they didn't get their menses, they actually saw it as a worrisome imbalance in their body. And that when they used to take abortifacients or herbs or tinctures to expel the pregnancy, they thought that they were just restoring their flow. They thought there was something wrong with their body and they needed to restore their flow. Now, in 1828, a German physician, Karl Ernst von Baer, he proposed the 4 laws of animal development and discovered that all mammals start their lives as a single cell. So when we say zygote, that's not specific to humans. It's a stage of mammalian development. So whether it's a mouse or an elephant, they both start their lives as a single cell and then grow to develop into whatever their capacity is for their species. Now, Dr. Horatio Storer and the American Medical Association, after this view started spreading throughout the world, they used this finding to lobby states to pass abortion laws that protected the unborn from the moment of fertilization. The only legal exception was actually for life of the mother, so a situation in which a woman could die if she didn't have an abortion procedure. And we'll talk about this later, but there is a document called the Dublin Declaration, where I believe it's thousands of medical doctors have said an abortion is never medically necessary. So the early termination of a pregnancy could be, but not an abortion. And the difference between those two is when we say abortion, we're talking about typical procedures that actually destroy the zygote, embryo, or fetus before it's removed from the woman's body. But you can do I wouldn't call it safe, but you can do a procedure that removes the zygote, embryo, or fetus without destroying it. And that's something that happens with an ectopic pregnancy. So there's a debate about whether or not abortion is ever medically necessary, but I have talked to many pro-life physicians who say there are absolutely scenarios in which early termination of a pregnancy or premature delivery is necessary, but not an abortion procedure. So after this campaign from the American Medical Association, there were state abortion restrictions in every state and in every territory for over a century. So most people don't know that abortion was illegal, maybe some people here, but a lot of the younger people, they didn't know there was ever a time when it was illegal because they grew up under Roe v. Wade. But even though it was illegal, abortion procedures still took place. And we hear a lot of rhetoric about back alley abortions. And the interesting thing is, back alley abortions didn't actually take place in back alleys. The phrase refers to the fact that women would have to enter abortion clinics and hospitals through the back alley entrance. So that's an example of a misleading term, and it implants an idea in our minds. I mean, I could actually see the back alley when I hear that term, because I heard it at a young age, and I imagined a procedure taking place in a dark, seedy alley. As to why somebody would do that when they could do it in a hospital, it didn't make a lot of sense, and that's because they didn't. So legal abortions were actually performed by physicians. Over 90% were performed by medically licensed physicians. And soon after, though, male lawyers actually lobbied women's organizations to push for reform of these abortion laws. Now, due to the lack of protections for pregnant women, and what this meant was since Roe v. Wade, since 1973, we've passed a lot of protections against the discrimination of pregnant women. So women could be dismissed from their colleges if they became pregnant out of wedlock. But now we have different laws that actually prevent that form of discrimination. But back then, because they faced these detriments that Roe v. Wade talked about, Roe v. Wade found a right to have an abortion before fetal viability, like I had mentioned. Now, however, as with all rights, the court found that the right to have an abortion is not absolute. So there are exceptions. And what they found was that a state's right to protect a preborn human supersedes the right to abortion, so it's more important than the right to abortion, but only after fetal viability, because they could not find a consensus on when life begins. And they actually said this in Roe v. Wade. They said, yes. Oh, I really appreciate that question, sir. So fetal viability, interestingly enough, it just has to do with lung development. So technically, if if a fetus had the capacity to develop on a respirator at a younger age, that would be when viability is. So viability is just whenever they're able to survive outside of the womb, and the biggest issue that they face is that their lungs are not developed enough to take enough oxygen. So there's actually researchers who are working on artificial wombs, and it's been done with lambs. They're actually driving back the age of viability because they're perfecting what is basically a plastic bag with fluid to simulate an artificial womb. Now, this is a changing point. So it's not only historically variable, it's variable based on the hospital. So in 1973, it was set at 28 weeks. That was when most fetuses were able to survive on a respirator. Today, it's 24 weeks, but there have actually been unborn children who survive at 21 weeks, at 22 weeks. The smallest baby ever born that survived was 9 ounces. So if the technology changes, and that's the other point, obviously, top medical care in a Manhattan hospital has a different ability to help the infant survive compared to a hospital in Africa or a rural part of America. So when they said fetal viability, it's not like this was some crucial point that confers humanity or personhood. It was just a pragmatic decision based on what medical science was able to do at the time. So it doesn't determine whether or not you're a human, even though that's what most pro-abortion people say. They believe that you're literally not a human before you're able to be viable outside the womb, even though that could literally change state by state or year by year. Was that satisfying, sir? Good. I'm glad. So again, since the court could not find a consensus on when life begins, and they actually contemplated it, they said when philosophers and theologians and doctors could not arrive at a consensus, they felt that they were unable to recognize the view that a human's life begins at fertilization. They also recognized that at the time, the preborn were not recognized as persons under other laws. So at the time, if a person attacked a pregnant woman, causing her to lose her pregnancy, killing the fetus, it wasn't always treated as a homicide. Today, the majority of states have what are called fetal homicide laws. So in 2003, I don't know if anyone remembers the case of Scott Peterson. He had killed his pregnant wife, Lacey Peterson, who was pregnant with their son, Connor. Because of that high-profile case, the Congress passed what's called the Unborn Victims of Violence Act. This is basically a sentencing enhancement of an additional 5-year prison sentence for anybody who commits one of a series of felonies that result in the death of an unborn child. After that, states started adopting these fetal homicide laws. So there was one case where it was actually a doctor. He had drugged his pregnant girlfriend with the abortion pill, and it caused her to lose her pregnancy, and he had actually been prosecuted and convicted of homicide. So if we're protecting the unborn at the moment of fertilization from a killing done by somebody other than the mother, the question is, why are we not criminalizing a physician who kills an unborn child in an abortion procedure? Now, because of Roe v. Wade, though, states cannot restrict abortion before viability, and they can restrict it afterwards, but they don't have to. So right now, I believe it's 42 states have abortion restrictions. Most of them are at fetal viability. So the earliest possible point that they can restrict abortion access, they do. But Roe provides no protections to preborn humans, grants them no rights, and it does not recognize them as humans or persons. Next slide. So for years, and some of you might have been part of these efforts or supported them, the pro-life movement tried to pass what are called human life amendments. They were trying to amend the U.S. Constitution to ensure that fetuses had rights, constitutional rights, which would effectively overrule Roe v. Wade and ensure that abortion was illegal. However, after repeated failures, states worked to restrict abortion with state abortion laws. In 1992, the court agreed to hear a case called Planned Parenthood v. Casey. We had a huge advantage on the Supreme Court, and unfortunately at the last minute, Justice Kennedy flipped his vote, and they maintained Roe v. Wade. And part of the reason was they argued that no change in circumstances had required the court to overrule that prior holding. And as I'll talk about later, now we have these pieces of evidence, right? So it might have been the case in 1973 that there was no consensus on when life begins, but now we have one of biologists. It might have been the case that fetuses had no protection in other non-abortive contexts, but now we see that they do. But in 2014, the court basically tried to make it more difficult for states to pass laws by saying that it wasn't just about whether or not it was after viability that you could restrict abortion, but you had to prove that there were benefits to that law. Now, luckily, in 2020, in the Louisiana case, June Medical Services versus Russo, I'm not sure, has anybody heard of that case? It was talked about several months ago. It was a Louisiana abortion regulation case, and they went to the Supreme Court. Now, and Illinois Right to Life, we actually wrote a brief. We wrote what's called an amicus brief supporting the Louisiana abortion regulation. Unfortunately, we lost, and the Louisiana law was struck down, but they moved it back to the 1992 standard, which caused Planned Parenthood to drop many of their lawsuits against states for their abortion restrictions because they were only suing because they thought they could prove there was no benefit to the laws. And once there was that holding, they ended up abandoning a lot of their challenges. And that's what's going on now, right? States continue to pass laws that challenge Roe's central holding. They pass laws that restrict abortion at fetal heartbeat, which is around the 6-week mark. They pass laws that are related to pain capability. So the Senate last year, the U.S. Senate, had actually tried to pass what's called the Pain Capable Abortion Act to protect the unborn at 20 weeks. And there's a little debate about when they can actually feel pain for the first time. Dr. Maureen Kondik, she's one of the leading experts. She's actually testified that they can feel it at 8 weeks, but others push back and say we can only guarantee that it's at 20 weeks, and that's part of the reason why the Senate tried to pass the 20-week law. Next slide. So I've inundated you with a little too much legalese, a little too much history, so let's just take a quick break. Let's take a step back and try to dive a little deeper into the actual way to talk about abortion. So for starters, I think it's really important for us to think about what position we find ourselves in strategically. So since abortion is legal throughout the country, in all honesty, the pro-abortion side has the upper hand. They don't have the upper hand in terms of morality or truth in so many ways, but just strategically, they simply have to defend against our arguments while we have to affirmatively prove to them or convince them or educate them on why our side is right, so to speak. We are the ones who need to change hearts and minds with the affirmative case for why the unborn deserve rights. Now, most in the pro-life movement, they focus on how abortion kills babies and how it hurts women. They cite the physical and psychological damage that abortion can have and discuss the benefits of motherhood. And it's all true. You know, from a historical perspective, from a theological perspective, and just about any other perspective, there is no single more important thing that a person could do than to give birth to a child spending their time prioritizing the well-being of their child over theirs. You know, humans, sorry to wax too poetic, but we are really built to love and to give love, and the relationship between a parent and a child is special. However, a pro-abortion person can point out that some women who have abortions are already mothers, or that a woman who wants to have an abortion can simply kill their child and have another one later. So appealing to the benefit of child rearing and parenthood, it might win over some, but it is not going to create the kind of moral impetus for abortion restrictions that are appealing to the rights of the unborn. After all, as I said before, pro-life is just a shortened version of the phrase pro-right to life. And really, we're a human rights movement. I know we don't usually talk about it in this way because the pro-abortion side, they've co-opted that language. They say that abortion is a human right. They say that they're the human rights advocates. But early pro-lifers, as I suggested, they were proud civil rights advocates. They saw themselves as abolitionists of slavery. They saw the fight for fetal rights as the same kind of fight that those abolitionists and civil rights leaders fought for before. So again, since we are trying to fight for those rights, the other side simply has to defend. And let's see, let me jump ahead a little bit. Okay, I want you to try to think about the argument for fetal rights like you think about the gospel, trying to spread the gospel. So in Christian and Catholic circles, when people talk about evangelizing, or in the evangelical term, soul winning, they say stay on the cross. And what that means is they're trying to tell you not to get distracted by discussions on whether premarital sex is a sin, why bad things happen in the world, or any of a number of questions that they use to distract you when you're trying to spread the gospel to them. Now, similarly with fetal rights, distractions on whether there should be exceptions for pregnancies that result from rape or incest, that's one of their main distractions. Let's not talk about the 99% of abortions that are done electively. Let's focus on, that's their tactic. Let's just focus on ones in the most extreme cases. Let's talk about what should happen when an 11-year-old girl gets pregnant versus, again, the 95 to 99% of women who are able to have a child and give it up for adoption, but would rather have an abortion. So they try to talk about, how much can abortion laws really reduce the abortion rate? They try to use these distractions that pale in comparison to the fact that tens of millions of humans are abortively killed each year around the world, and how we need to recognize the rights of the unborn. So some people will actually recognize the unborn as humans, but then they'll claim that restricting abortion will not reduce it. Or they will say, if you really cared about life, you would work to reform the prison system, support all immigration, or some other concept that they deem is essential for, again, the consistent life ethic. I've actually heard workers in the pro-life movement say that pro-life organizations like Illinois Right to Life should spend as much time on abortion as reforming drug laws in Illinois. So distractions, they abound. Stay on the cross, focus on the biological humanity and the legal rights of the unborn. And it is important that some will still refuse to recognize the unborn as humans. Like I said, this might be one of that case where they're in the 15%, that there really is no ground to be gained with them. Like someone who believes that the earth is flat, it will be difficult to convince them otherwise. They see abortion laws as an attempt to control women and to stop people from having premarital relations, for instance. They simply see you as someone who believes that women should lose their rights. So your only hope with those people are to just try to educate them. As one prominent pro-life speaker and apologist says, his name's Scott Klusendorf, he says that your job is to just put a pebble in their shoe. When they try to use their typical rhetoric to justify abortion, put that pebble in their shoes so the next time they say something, maybe they think about what you shared with them. You're just trying to plant a seed. And again, this has a strong corollary to spreading the gospel. When you have an opportunity with somebody, you're not trying to completely change their worldview and save them in that moment necessarily. Sometimes you're just trying to plant that seed, and for all you know, somebody else will water it later. So perhaps the next time somebody tries to deny the humanity of the unborn to you, maybe they'll remember that you told them that biologists all agree on when life begins. The next time they try to claim that the unborn are humans, but that they're not persons, maybe they'll remember your explanation of how the 14th Amendment works. And just quickly, so personhood, has anybody ever encountered this when talking about somebody with somebody about abortion, that they try to say that fetuses aren't persons? Yeah. So personhood, it really is supposed to be and I know interchangeably we all use human and person the same, right? We don't really have a robust understanding of those being distinct concepts. And part of the reason is because in the law, they're actually used interchangeably. Personhood in philosophy, in metaphysics, in these academic circles, they try to say that personhood extends to non-humans. So they've actually said that a river could be given legal personhood. In Argentina, an orangutan was given legal personhood. So it's meant to expand the class of who is deserving of legal protection outside of the human race. Now, interestingly, in the abortion debate, they use it to actually exclude members of the human race from the category of personhood. And that's part of the way that you know that that's a dishonest attempt. If this is something that we're trying to extend to artificial intelligence, how are you denying the personhood of humans for the first 24 to 40 weeks of their lives? So again, you're not trying to convince them that you're right when you're having a discussion. You're not trying to prove yourself. You're not trying to prove how smart you are. You're simply trying to educate somebody who is uninformed or misinformed. And again, I really understand that it's easy to become defensive and to allow your emotions to take control. You can hear some pretty disgusting rhetoric from people who will say things like, because there are issues in the foster care system, that child is better off being killed than being raised in the foster care system. Some prominent figures in the pro-abortion movement have suggested that abortion is necessary to ensure that we have a booming economy. They've tried to tie the finding in Roe v. Wade to billions of dollars of growth in our economy. So you're going to hear a lot of disgusting rhetoric from people who devalue life. And I think it's just important, if you treat it as an opportunity to share what you know, instead of something that you're trying to defend your own identity against somebody, it could help you to keep a calmer head and to focus, to stay on the cross and to focus on what really matters. So, and then obviously, if you keep judgment out of the conversation, you might be able to better educate your friends and families with love and compassion. Next slide. So sometimes we make, we could want to make a bigger claim that, all abortion should be illegal, and certainly that's what we feel, and that's fine. But when you're having those discussions, sometimes making a bit of a tighter claim could prevent you from getting caught up in those distractions. So if you make a big claim like every abortion should be illegal, they're going to go to the wildest example and make you litigate that case. But if you make a tighter claim, that can cause them to reassess their own position. So a tight claim would be, the unborn are humans, all humans are persons who equally deserve rights, and abortion is homicide and should be illegal. Assert things like this, and then have them explain to you why they think that some humans don't deserve rights, why some humans aren't persons, or why some forms of homicide should be legal. So if they say something like, well, the mother already has too many kids, or the father just lost his job, then you get to frame it as, is that a justifiable homicide? Do you think that not having enough money when you could give your child up for adoption, that is an adequate legal justification? And when they say, well, yeah, in the case of abortion, you can put it to them, would that apply to an infant? Because that's something that really undergirds what we're talking about with abortion: equality. It's very easy for them to try to discriminate against the unborn, but we have to stand firm in that knowledge that if you truly believe in equality, if you believe there's no difference between a 5-year-old child and an 80-year-old woman in terms of whether or not they deserve equal protection under the law, which that is one of the oldest concepts in the American and Western legal tradition, if that's the case, you have to get them to understand that those two things are truly equal with equal rights. Next slide. So now that we've discussed strategy a bit, now I'm going to get back into some findings and some more heavy concepts. Now, similar to the first 5 points I suggested, these are what I call the 6 irrefutable arguments of the abortion debate. And these are the things that we could stand tall in, knowing that they are just as true as 1 + 1 = 2. So again, might seem a little repetitive, but I just want to make sure that everything's fully explained. So organisms with human DNA that are developing in the human life cycle are humans. That's the reason why that single cell is a human. Because, some people will say, well, what about a sperm? What about an egg? Sperm and eggs are actually only 1/2 of the genetic code. They're called haploid organisms. And then zygotes, the moment of fertilization, that's when it gets the full genetic code that you'll have for the rest of your life. And the reason why it needs to be developing in the human life cycle is, what's the difference between my toenail cell and that organism? The difference is, yes, they both have human DNA, but only one is developing in the human life cycle. And again, since human zygotes, embryos, and fetuses, since those apply to them, they are biological humans. So from a biological perspective, they are humans. And again, this is something, let's just say it took a lot of time and effort to be able to prove this. And I know it's simple and it's something you've known for a long time, but being able to prove it is different than, knowing something. So I had actually spent 500 hours going to the websites for biology departments around the world. I had to translate Chinese websites into English, Russian websites into English, to figure out how to contact these biologists. And I had people who were born in 86 different countries around the world. And if even those who are, 85% were pro-choice, even for those abortion supporters, for them to admit it, that's something that you should really rest on, and it's something that you should use in your advocacy. And again, all biological humans are persons, and that I think the degree to which you can really communicate to somebody that the terms are interchangeable under the law, and being able to cite the fact that we have fetal homicide laws, it shows that they're already recognized as persons under the law, just in a non-abortive context. And the only reason they're not in the abortive context is because the Supreme Court has not considered these arguments yet. And if this will help for a little bit of hope, I'm actually finishing up what's called a law review article. So the Tennessee Law Review, they agreed to publish a 95-page, long explanation of what I'm talking about today. And it's our hope that that could one day be considered by the Supreme Court when an abortion law is challenged and brought to the Supreme Court. And that's the crux of my argument, is that they had actually set out in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, like I talked about in 1992, that there are circumstances in which they will decide that their previous decision is wrong. That circumstance is when there's been a change in a fact that robs the original justification. So kind of like with Brown v. Board, this was the case that stopped racial segregation in our schools in the United States. They had overturned a previous decision from 1896 because they found out that separate is unequal. In 1896, they thought that separate could be equal, and they found out that it couldn't be. So they had to overturn themselves. Similarly, since the Supreme Court still believes that the preborn are not humans until viability, and because they still believe that there are no protections for fetuses, that law is still good. But if they take notice of it, they can overturn it. Next slide. Okay, so again, pretty simple. All killings of humans by other humans are homicides, and they are illegal without an appropriate legal justification. Like I said, self-defense is typically, obviously in capital crimes with the death penalty, that's an acceptable legal justification. But what isn't is the right to make decisions about your body. I cannot use my right to so-called bodily autonomy to pick up a gun and to use it to kill somebody. Similarly, a pregnant person cannot use their body to kill their unborn child. It's not an acceptable legal justification. And Roe v. Wade itself, the Supreme Court justices actually said, if fetuses are recognized as humans, the case for abortion rights collapses. Even years later, the justices who found in favor of Roe v. Wade, they said that if you can prove that there's not a fundamental and well-recognized difference between fetuses and humans, that the 14th Amendment would actually guarantee the protection of the unborn. So obviously, if we could get it that they recognize those two facts, we're actually pretty well set up. So finally, an abortion, since it kills a fetus who is both a biological human and a legal person, it should be illegal. Okay, so let's see, 725. Next slide. Let's actually jump ahead a few. Okay. And then these are some 10 important facts. I can touch base on them later, but I can also actually send them to you. So in our previous pro-life training tour last year when we came here, we sent it around as a handout. And these are just kind of more detailed findings, part of the research that I did on the abortion debate. So that's good, thank you. So in terms of abortion in the election, the only thing I want to touch on is what's called the Hyde Amendment. So essentially, there are those in this country who are trying to repeal the Hyde Amendment, and there are those who are trying to support it. So named after its chief sponsor, Henry Hyde, who is actually a congressman from Illinois, it prevents federal funds from being used to directly pay for abortions. And one scholar, Dr. Michael J. New, he has actually done the research and found that this amendment has saved 2.4 million lives, 60,000 each year, because they either don't have the money or they're trying to save up the money. They end up changing their minds and deciding to give life to their children. So that's part of the reason why this is so important. And especially in states like Illinois, where we have Medicaid that we use to cover everybody's abortions. There are states that don't have those protections, or those entitlements, we'll call them, for abortion procedures. So it's crucial that we maintain the Hyde Amendment. Next slide. So God willing, we're headed to a post-Roe world. Since 3 Supreme Court justices who interpret the Constitution faithfully, because they've been appointed, many predict that the court will soon overturn Roe v. Wade. Now, they could either overturn Roe v. Wade, and that would return the issue back to the states. And what that would mean is some more liberal states that are really pro-abortion, they could still permit abortion throughout pregnancy. But then the other states, they would probably ban abortion throughout pregnancy. And I believe it's actually 20 states have what are called trigger laws, which means the moment Roe v. Wade is overturned, old laws will go back into effect, the ones that were before Roe v. Wade. And some laws have actually been passed recently. So if it's overturned, abortion will be immediately illegal. Now, unfortunately, Illinois had that law on the books for decades, and we just, it was just repealed, I believe it was last year. So, or it might have been 2 years ago. So unfortunately, in Illinois, especially because of the passage of the Reproductive Health Act, abortion would probably be just as legal as it is today. But the court can also find that fetal rights are guaranteed under the 14th Amendment, in which case states would actually be required to protect the unborn. So after Brown v. Board, the case I was talking about with racial segregation, there were states that didn't want to desegregate their schools. And the Supreme Court actually heard a second case and reaffirmed that the states had to follow their holding. So similarly with abortion, if we find rights for the unborn, even if a state wouldn't want to restrict abortion, they could be compelled to. Next slide. Oh, please, yes. How long, what was the last part? Okay, so, right. So one of the things that the Reproductive Health Act did, it redefined fetal viability. So in every other state, it's at 24 weeks. That's what's been established. Now there actually is no discernible point. They leave it up to the judgment of the physician. So technically, and they actually set out in the Reproductive Health Act the factors for considering whether or not a preborn child is viable, and they said that they could take into consideration factors like a woman's health, the health of the family, psychological factors, that this would discern whether or not, actually I got that a little confused, so that's in terms of the health exception. So what they did was they said that it is illegal after viability, which can be determined by the doctors, and then they found a health exception that could be based on those factors that I just mentioned. So literally, based on the health of the family, and I gotta be honest, I spend a lot of time, unfortunately, on Twitter interacting with abortion doctors. And the stories that they'll share and the things that they'll say, I mean, famously, Dr. Leroy Carhart, he was actually interviewed by the BBC, and he kept talking about the unborn as babies and as children. And he said that even though he recognized them as children, he believed that there is no right to life until it gets outside of its mother's womb. So when you have these doctors who are that sympathetic to abortion rights, they can determine viability whenever they want, and they can determine whether or not there is good cause for a woman to have that abortion. So in terms of familial health, which is what it said, the husband could say, I just lost my job yesterday. I know it's the 36th week, but we need to have an abortion. And if the abortion doctor wants to do it, he can do it legally. Because the other thing is, they actually removed abortion from the criminal code. So there's no context in which a doctor can be charged with a crime. So basically, they not only created all of the excuses for a doctor to perform an abortion for any reason, they even removed it from the criminal code, so there's literally no way to even charge them with a crime. So unfortunately, it's about as bad as it gets. New York passed their Reproductive Health Act, and then we one-upped them. Ours is even worse. And that's sadly our reality, and that's why it kind of rings hollow when we hear certain prominent people in the pro-life movement say that we need to return the issue to the states, that the Supreme Court shouldn't be making those determinations. I personally disagree. Because of fetal rights, I don't trust states to do what they should be doing, because we see how the political process has corrupted the abortion debate. And the Supreme Court, they're supposed to be the arbiters of truth. They're the embodiment of justice. That's why we call them Supreme Court justices. Now, I understand they've been corrupted too, and that's part of the reason is they're not faithfully interpreting the Constitution. They see it as a living Constitution that should be able to be interpreted however they see fit. They could call something a tax if they wanted. They could do whatever they want, right? But for those who feel an obligation to interpret the Constitution as it was actually written, trust me when I say this case is bulletproof. Fetal rights are absolutely guaranteed by the Constitution. It's just a matter of whether or not we could get the right justices who will interpret it that way. And that's why when we say return it to the states, and we could actually go to the next slide, unfortunately, go back to the last one. Their approach is to set up these regional abortion centers. So we actually saw this last year in Fairview Heights, and unfortunately, even under COVID, in the time of the lockdowns, Planned Parenthood opened another clinic in Waukegan. So Planned Parenthood and the rest of the pro-abortion movement, and I'm sorry, Miss, was that a satisfying answer, or did you have a follow-up before I continue? Yeah, do you want to? Yeah. Right, so Born Alive Infant Protection Act, it actually had failed in the U.S. Congress. Only one side voted for it, and then everybody on the other side voted against it. They saw it as somehow restricting the rights of women to ensure that any infant that is born after a botched abortion, as you put it, that we wanted to ensure that they would be safe, that they would be given medical care. And this was partly because of, there was a Democratic governor in Virginia, don't want to mention any names, but he had given an interview suggesting that physicians would keep a survivor comfortable until they decided what to do with it. And some of these stories that I hear, working in this movement, somebody came to a tour event last year and told me a horror story about, it was an older woman and her adult son was with her. Fascinating young man, profoundly autistic, spoke 12 languages, 12 instruments and spoke several languages. Brilliant young man, he sang for me, it was very touching. His mother said that the doctors tried to force her to get an abortion. When they didn't, and he was born at a very young age, that they had actually wanted to put, I couldn't even believe she described it this way, and I apologize for sharing it, but wanted to put a cake topper over his body to suffocate the child. So with this Born Alive Protection Act, it's not just about those who survive abortions, but that any infant has to be given the same medical care that any other infant does. But unfortunately, they roundly opposed it. And if I recall correctly, my understanding is there was a state abortion, a state law in Illinois, and that had been repealed by the Reproductive Health Act. So unfortunately, yes. Yeah. I mean, it's so sad to see, I don't want to, because we're in the sanctuary, I'm going to use very careful language, but we'll just say that some have actually, the attorneys general for one of the sides have said that they will not support any attorney general to be elected who isn't 100% pro-abortion. Unfortunately, we have seen calls from one side suggest that you don't belong in the party if you're not 100% pro-abortion. Some governors of that side have said, you don't belong in our state if you're not 100% pro-abortion. Sorry, go ahead, sir. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So part of it, sir, and I touched on this earlier, it's a bit of a mirage. It's a lie that they use politically as a political football to suggest it's really one side and the other. It isn't. There's actually 1/3 of that side believes in abortion restrictions and identify as pro-life. So it's a bit of a misnomer. It's really, when I say that 15% who believe in abortion access in any scenario, those are the people leading that party. So if they're leading them, they make it seem like this is the only acceptable position. But they're ignoring the millions in their party. And actually, so I've had the pleasure of talking to Kristen Day. She is the head of Democrats for Life of America. And that's her work. So she actually took out this huge ad in the New York Times talking to that party saying, you have to recognize us. You can't drive us out of your party. But unfortunately, a lot of candidates have suggested you can't be in that party unless you're 100% pro-abortion. And it's because it is fundamental to their worldview. Not the case for everybody on that side, but for that extreme element. I mean, some have suggested it's a sacrament, that it is the highest form of autonomy, which is part and parcel of their worldview. So it wasn't always the case, and unfortunately it's been co-opted as a political football that both sides have used. And there's a lot of history I could get into in terms of Nixon's strategy and how they courted the Catholic vote, and there's a lot behind it. But I think the biggest take home is that it's just simply not true, that it's the leadership, that they are so committed, and that's for political reasons, in terms of fundraising, in terms of currying the woman vote. And I'm sorry, sir, I saw your hand up for a moment. Oh, okay, wonderful. Thank you, sir. Yeah. 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 And unfortunately, Illinois, we had one of the last representatives from that side, and he was knocked out of office, and they poured the money that they poured into that race to beat him. And it's solely because they almost saw him as like a pollutant, something that was corrupting their party, because they feel like they need to drive everybody out to protect their worldview. Because part of it is, let's just say, it's very difficult to recognize these facts and still support abortion. I've seen it. There are some philosophers, David Boonin, he talks about how he's had children and he looks at the ultrasound of his child and he knows it's a person, but he believes that no person has the right to use a pregnant woman's body. He likens it to the notion that you have no right to force your cousin to donate bone marrow, so why should we be able to force a pregnant woman to carry a pregnancy to term? Now, the clear problem with that is there's a huge difference between compelled action, where you're forced to do something, and restricted action. So no one's saying that pregnant women should be taken into custody, handcuffed to a bed until they give birth. It's just simply that there are criminal penalties that can deter physicians from performing abortion procedures. And so fetal rights, the other thing is, it's not only something we're fighting for. Dozens of states, dozens of countries in South America recognize the rights of the unborn. Germany recognized it in 1975, and they actually have half of the abortion rate that we do because they require every woman to have mandatory counseling and to have a 3-day waiting period because they're trying to ensure that she carries it to term if they can convince her. And that's what they see as like due process. Basically, their ability to legally protect the unborn is to mandate that it can only be in the first trimester or if the woman is going to die. And even then, they have to get counseling and they have to be discouraged from having an abortion procedure. So this case for fetal rights, it isn't that unique. I mean, it's interesting that Germany has it and they've been able to reduce their abortion rate. And hopefully that's something that would happen here. But because of Roe v. Wade, it's incredibly difficult to even pass a 24-hour waiting period. And that's part of the tactic of the pro-abortion side. Anything we try to do is immediately described as trying to infringe on a woman's rights. That case that I talked about in Louisiana, it had nothing to do with abortion rights. It simply required that abortion providers have admitting privileges into an emergency room and other things to ensure that actual trained physicians are performing abortions. Because in some states, they'll actually let a nurse practitioner perform an abortion. And what we're trying to push back in is, at the very least, it should be a trained physician. It shouldn't be an optometrist being able to perform an abortion. It should be somebody who's at least trained in it to ensure the survival of the woman. And even that, they fought just as hard as if we were trying to overturn Roe v. Wade. I was out in front of the Supreme Court with a big old sign about when life begins with part of the team from Illinois Right to Life. And I mean, the vitriol and the things that they said to me and to the other pro-lifers and, physical contact and crowding you. I mean, you would have thought that we were literally trying to take away Roe v. Wade and make it that you can go to jail for taking an abortion pill. It was simply about the protection of women, and they fought it full bore. And that's the thing. Part of the reason why they do, they know that the way you change laws are incrementally. Small changes, that's what they've used to make most of their legal changes. Oh, we just want birth control. This has nothing to do with abortion. They get birth control, and then they use the case that gave them birth control to say, now we need abortion. And they know that the incremental approach works, so they fight us if we try to take a centimeter or if we take a mile. They're going to fight us just as hard. And as I was talking about earlier in terms of the regional abortion centers, because they're worried that Roe v. Wade will be overturned, what they've started to do is strategically place what are called mega abortion clinics. Not these simple abortion clinics that you might see in a neighborhood, but major centers, because they will serve, that's a way of putting it, they will accept clients from bordering states that do not have abortion access. So the clinic on the Illinois-Missouri border is Fairview Heights in Illinois, and they're worried that Missouri will lose abortion access, so then Missourians could come over the border to get abortions in Illinois. Similarly, the Waukegan clinic that just recently opened up, that's right near Wisconsin, and they will be able to come in if they make abortion illegal. So that's, they try to talk about Illinois as if it's an abortion oasis for the Midwest, that people will be able to come from everywhere. And that's part of the reason why returning it to the states, it's not good enough. They're going to travel for abortions. Next slide. Now, in terms of some of these laws that we've passed, one of the last laws that are actually on the books, a good law, is the parental notification law. And Illinois has had this for years, even though the pro-abortion side tried to fight it. And what this requires that if an underage person, if a minor, if they go through what's called the judicial bypass. And basically, a young woman, a high school student, can go to her teacher and ask to be brought to a judge, and then the judge will give her permission to have an abortion without the consent of her parent. When that happens, even though she's able to do that, the abortion clinic needs to notify a parent or a guardian at least 24 hours before the procedure. And this has actually saved thousands of lives. This is an important thing because we know, unfortunately, these young girls, sometimes they're worried what their parents will think. They'll judge them for having had premarital relations. And little do they know how important it is for their parents to know so their parents could be supportive and reinforce the importance of life. But they are trying to either repeal it or change the adults who can be notified. So instead of a parent or a guardian, they want it to be that a clergy person, that a teacher, that a family member, a friend, any adult would be able to serve as the person who gets notified. So this is a real important, tangible way to actually save lives, is to maintain this law. So if you could actually go to the last slide, and then I just have a little more, and then we'll go to question and answer. And this is a lot of redundant stuff. A lot of it I had touched on already. Okay, so in closing, I want to thank you, again, not only for being here tonight, but for standing for life. I really hope you all appreciate what a tremendous gift it is that you know the truth. So many of our fellow Americans either never learned the truth or they were taught a lie. It is with this spirit that I hope you approach any discussion you have on abortion, this humility. We're not better than anyone because we know better than them. We are blessed to have not been tricked into believing a lie like they have. Think of them like the people in the past who were raised to believe that slavery and segregation were good. I mean, were those people evil, or were they products of evil times? Try to have compassion for a person whose respect for life has been short-circuited by misinformation, pain, or ego. Many of the people we talk to, this isn't talked about enough, they have had abortions themselves. They have helped a family member get an abortion. And think about how important it is for their mind to cope with that reality by justifying it, by fighting for, it was just a clump of cells that I killed. Because if they had to think about it as no different from leaving their infant in a dumpster to die, think about the psychological pain and emotional pain that they can endure. So try to have compassion for them, much like the abortion patient who might have been misled into thinking it was just a clump of cells, that it was something like a tumor removal. We have tons of stories of these. There are actually thousands of depositions that have been filed saying that women were misled about the abortion procedure. They were lied to about what their preborn human was, and they feel duped, and a lot have pain afterwards. So, at the end of the day, they were victimized by this culture just like the preborn human. Not just like, in a different way, but. So finally, I want to call to attention the fact that you can have an impact. This might feel like an abstract legal debate, but it's a real-life situation that touches so many lives. When you talk to someone about abortion, you might be the only person who will be able to explain to them that every abortion kills a human. You might be the only person who can help them see that all humans, born and unborn, equally deserve rights. Your sister, your brother, your daughter, your son, your niece, your nephew, your grandson, your granddaughter, they're all part of a culture that justifies abortion, and you have the capacity to reach them. And it isn't just about them. Think about who they might reach. If you talk to 10 people and they talk to 10 people each, you didn't reach 10, you reached 100. There's no telling how many lives you can save. And that's what we're here to do. Remember, we're not, spreading the love of a football team. We're not promoting the Cubs. We're not sharing book recommendations. This is important. We're trying to save lives. we're trying to educate those who have been misinformed. Consider the story of a man and a wife on a beach, and they see that it's covered with starfish that had been washed ashore. The man picks up a single starfish and throws it back into the ocean. His wife turns to him and says, "Man, there's got to be thousands. What did that matter? What difference did it make?" The man smiles and he says, "It made a difference to that one." With that spirit, I want you to keep that story in your heart. You might not have been put on earth to overturn Roe v. Wade or to save millions of lives. But if you've helped even one woman choose life, imagine that child coming back to you one day, thanking you for interceding on their behalf. Wouldn't that have made it all worth it? Okay. And then, so to contact me, you can send an email to steve@illinoisrighttolife.org. If you want to register for our email list, you can email Sarah. And then to donate, you could visit our website. We're going around the state. I think Saturday night, it's in Mahomet, Illinois. I don't even know how to pronounce that. It's like a 2.5-hour drive on a Saturday evening, so that'll be fun. So we travel around the state to do these tour events. And also, for more info, Illinois Right to Life, we actually set up a website called whendoeslifebegin.org. And this has hundreds of sources from scientists, lawyers, judges, pro-abortion people. Dozens of pro-abortion people have admitted when a human's life begins and the nature of abortion. So you can actually see that we not only give you the citations, we actually took pictures of every source so you could see the source as it appeared, because there's some research that suggests if you just type out the words that somebody else has said, if somebody's opposed to you, they're not going to believe them. But if you could actually show the real source, they're more likely to believe you. So that's just a good resource. But again, I want to thank you all for being here tonight, and I'm happy to answer any questions you all have. Yeah. Yes, happy to. Yeah. Okay, so in terms of whether or not Planned Parenthood is a private organization or a nonprofit, so for-profit or non-for-profit, unfortunately they play a heck of a sleight of hand. So they are technically a 501c3 tax-exempt organization, and what they say is because they're a nonprofit, there's no profit motive. At the end of the day, they are showing revenue above expenses in the hundreds of millions each year. Of course they have a financial motive, even if it's not technically a profit motive. So the difference is revenue is money you take in, profit is money that you have at the end of the year that you can then either reinvest or you could give out to your shareholders, or like the owners of the company can take that money. So no, they cannot take the money, but think about the financial motive. If they don't get enough donations, abortion clinics close. If abortion clinics close, people lose their jobs. Think about if they're getting tons in donations and ton in subsidies, they can have higher salaries, the CEOs. So clearly there are financial incentives. How they're able to pull their game is supposedly they are, not for profit. I believe they have an educational not-for-profit arm. I'm not too clear on the corporate governance structure, but basically the huge issue is whether or not they should be subsidized by the federal government. And in the last 4 years, there have been reductions in their funding, but they are still funded by the government. And there's a lot of questions as to, is the funding going to the organization or for abortion specifically? And a lot of that is just sleight of hand. If that organization doesn't get that money, then they have less money to spend on promoting abortion. So it's absolutely in our interest to starve them of any and all resources. Okay. Yes, sir.
Comment and a question. So the irrefutable arguments, the DNA,
Yeah.
I just like to highlight that, especially as a male.
Okay.
Often those conversations immediately get cut off at the knees because, hard to figure
Yeah.
I find that to be a very strong argument. But what would you say, as a lawyer, I'm sure you do this quite often, strongest argument on the pro-abortion side, and then the strongest argument on the pro-life side to combat that?
Okay, so you rightfully called out the fact that a lot of people pull, on the pro-abortion side, some underhanded tactics by trying to discriminate against you as a man, suggesting you don't have a right to make a determination of law or to educate them on the law, which would be akin to saying a judge can't make a decision in a case regarding child abuse unless they themselves are a parent. It makes no sense. That's not how our legal system works. Otherwise, we would have to have individual judges and lawyers for every conceivable situation. So the best way, there's different ways you can handle that. Actually, outside of the Supreme Court with the Louisiana case, somebody said that to me, and I said, well, how do you know I'm a man? They don't typically like that kind of smart alecky behavior. But the best way is to, like I said, call out the fact that these are abstract legal principles that anyone should be able to opine on or educate people on. And another good counter is what's suppressed in what they're trying to say is the fact that they believe it's only men who are trying to restrict abortion access. So there was actually a documentary on Netflix about Roe v. Wade, and they interviewed a lot of the leaders of the pro-life movement. Now, most of the leaders in the pro-life movement are actually women. So Americans United for Life, Students for Life, Live Action, all of the big organizations you've heard of, they're led by women. So they interviewed all these people, but surprise, surprise, they didn't feature any of those interviews. They left them all on the cutting room floor. And the biggest pro-life advocate in the movie was not even the executive director, but like a program director like me, at Texas Right to Life. So a state organization, they didn't use any of the powerful women as the representatives, and it's because they wanted to protect their narrative that the only reason you'd want to restrict abortion is because you want to control women's bodies, when that's not the case. Women are actually more likely to be pro-life in America than men. And that's a really good finding to put them on the back of their heels, is the notion that women actually want greater fetal protections than even men. As to your second question, what is the strongest pro-choice argument and what is the strongest pro-life argument? So it's a little difficult because there's different audiences, right? So I would make a different argument to an academic than I would somebody who, let's just say, hasn't spent years obsessing about these like minor issues. So in terms of a pro-choice argument that I think is difficult for most people is probably the personhood notion. So first off, they will fight you on the humanity. It's very difficult to get over that bar. That's part of the reason why it was so important to prove the scientific consensus. Now, even if you get past that bar, it's just so difficult for them to fully connect to the notion that it's a human, no different than a walking, talking human. And that's why the best way to counter that is to call out the fact that there's different abilities at every age. Is an infant not a human because it can't sexually reproduce? Because it can't walk? Because it can't talk? There's actually some cultures that don't recognize you as a person until you're 2 years old. Some don't let you be a full member of their tribe until you've had a child. So personhood is really this, historically, when used to restrict rights as opposed to be inclusive and expand rights, it's a disgusting concept that was used to justify slavery, was used to justify most of the abuses throughout human history. So I think that when they try that tack, you can defend against it well, but you just have to be really prepared, and you have to be strong in your convictions. Because it is really difficult when they, another thing about their strategy, they're coming from a place of emotion. They see it as compassionate. That like, yeah, sure, maybe justice requires this or equality requires this, but this woman doesn't want to have the child. So they see it as an emotional issue that they're coming from a place of compassion. But at the end of the day, what requires more compassion than seeing something that's 1 inch long and being willing to say, I will fight for that in the same way that I'll fight for my 5-year-old child? You know, the women who carry high-risk pregnancies to term because they care so much about that preborn life. So I think that's one of the difficult things. Do you have one that you felt is difficult in your life, sir?
Well, I used to use this was maybe, to your point, maybe a little bit too cute for I would say I'm pro-life and pro-choice.
Yes.
But I'm only pro-one first choice. Once you make your choices, and that, you don't get a second choice.
Right.
You react to the choice that was made previous to that. That doesn't always go very well.
No. So you had he has a very clever response that he's both pro-life and pro-choice, and that being pro-choice, he's pro the choice to create a child, but once it's created, it deserves all the rights that all other existing humans do. Yeah, and that's one of the difficult things is they're going to use a lot of language like, yeah, but it's an actual person. It's a real person. You know what I mean. It's not the same. How can you compare those two? And if you focus on the distinctions between, I mean, the human, it's a wide-ranging concept. That infant is very different from an adult. That infant, they can't survive on their own for a few days. They are totally dependent on an adult in the same, not the same, but to the same degree that a zygote is, that an embryo is, that a fetus is. So if you can communicate something like that, I think it'll make it easier. Now, in terms of what I think the strongest pro-life argument, surprise, surprise, I might be a little biased, but it's pretty much what I've spent years trying to study. And I really came at this from a logical, legal, and to some extent philosophical perspective. So some come at it from an emotional standpoint. This actually started when I was in a law school class. It was my first ever speech about abortion, and I was presenting the pro-life side. And I had been nervous for years to talk about abortion because I've gone to very liberal institutions. I mean, I've lost friends the moment I argued that a human's life begins at fertilization. Some people have said that that's judgmental and evil to give a fact like that could then trigger a woman into feeling like she had killed a human. So I was very nervous about it, and when I gave my speech, I said there's a scientific consensus on when life begins, and that was based on my review of medical textbooks. So I literally couldn't find one textbook, one scientific article that suggested a human's life begins at any point other than the very beginning. And my professor, when he turned back my speech, he wrote source and put a question mark next to it. And that was my moment that I realized, oh, if you want a source, I could find a source. And fortunately, I had actually surveyed thousands of Americans, asking them, who do you think is most qualified to determine when a human's life begins? Because who am I to say it's a scientific question? Like in Roe v. Wade, they said, maybe it's a theological question, maybe it's a philosophical question. And I had actually found that 80% of Americans believe that biologists are most qualified. And people who are pro-abortion were even more likely to select biologists. It was 92% of them. Pro-life people were a little lower because I don't think they trusted biologists, so they selected religious leaders. Nobody, very few selected voters or Supreme Court justices or philosophers. And then religious leaders, that was the second highest, but biologists was the focus. And it's because they think that when life begins is the crucial question in the abortion debate. They believe that a human's life is protectable once it begins. 93% said that. And they believe that everyone deserves to know when it begins so they can make informed abortion decisions. So some actually suggest that you cannot give informed consent to have that medical procedure unless you're informed that you are committing, a homicide. So I would say in terms of the best argument, I think the law is already set up for it, so why not use it? Unfortunately, using biblical authority, I really wish that was an approach that I thought would be successful today. But what I've learned is we pretty much know that they're only willing to battle on their playing field. They're not going to recognize the authority of the Bible, especially that 15%. But what they do recognize is human rights. What they do recognize is the Constitution. And it's just very fortunate that you can solely use secular concepts to make what I believe is the strongest argument for the pro-life side. Do we have any other questions? We're running a little over, so if anybody needs to head out or if we're done now, feel free to let me know. Oh, sure. Okay. Oh, sure. Thank you. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Mm. Right. So Trent Horn from CatholicAnswers.com, he has, I believe he has a series of books, but he has at least one book teaching people how to be pro-life apologists. It's a couple hundred pages, and they actually outline a lot of the pro-abortion arguments. So it can be useful to memorize those and to be prepared with whatever your counters are. Personally, again, my bias is to stay on that cross, stay on the gospel, because if you're trying to counter people's arguments, they could play that game all day. They could keep coming up with new arguments. Last night, we actually did an exercise where one side played the pro-abortion, one person played the pro-abortion side and the pro-life side, and trust me, it could go in so many directions. And that's why, to some extent, why worry about responding to their arguments as opposed to asserting the strong pro-life case? So those are my 2 cents, but thank you very much for that. Okay.
I just want to say thank you. Thank you to Dr. Thank you so much for sharing this information with us. So informative. And then also, just thank you online, and thank you everybody for taking time to just learn about the preciousness of life and what we can do to support the unborn. So as you know, for those of you who attend church here, we do have a process that ushers will come to your aisle. They'll start in the back and then move forward, and everybody can exit once the usher comes to your aisle. Thank you again so much. God bless.